Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, a few logistical notes. We have a little more than half an hour together today, and we are going to be recording this conversation. We encourage everyone to use the Q&A feature to submit questions at any point during the conversation for Liliana and Jordan. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Annie Shavel, CEO of The Intercept.
Thank you so much, Kate. Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Shavel, The Intercept's inaugural CEO, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you to today's event. The Intercept is at a very exciting inflection point where we have an opportunity to have greater reach and impact. And of course, we couldn't do this work without our community of supporters and friends. So thank you for being with us today. It's an honor to be with all of you, including some of our board members. So thanks for joining. As many of you know, the kind of journalism that The Intercept does is under threat, from financial pressures to changes to where and how people get their news. And of course, the specter of how generative AI is going to impact our industry and the world. With The Intercept, we feel hopeful about the future. We believe that engaging our audiences and producing high impact journalism is going to help light the way forward. So I'm very thrilled to introduce Roger Hodge, our editor-in-chief, who's going to moderate today's discussion with our terrific reporters. Roger, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm really excited to share two dynamic and amazing, really, reporters at The Intercept, Liliana Segura and Jordan Smith. And you all are really in for a treat because they are the best of the best. At The Intercept, we're committed to deep investigations that have real-world human impact. We're not chasing clicks. We're not taking our cues from the chattering classes or the social media churn. We're going after significant and important injustices and corruption. And there really is no subject that is more vulnerable to corruption and injustice than the criminal justice system. And in a way, the most really the cases that exemplify that really illustrate and illuminate the problems that we have in our society and at large, and in our justice system in particular, come into play in wrongful convictions and particularly in death penalty cases. So Liliana and Jordan have established themselves as really some of the most innovative and rigorous and impactful reporters in this area. And it was my great honor to edit them for years before my role changed. And so yeah, you're in for a treat, as I said. So I'd like to open with a recent case that we just really through almost single-handedly our reporting has led to the exoneration of Barry Jones. So Liliana, do you want to start off by telling us a little bit about that case and what's happened?
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, Roger, and everyone who's here. It's really fortuitous, the timing of this event, of this particular event, because it's really not every day that we get to sit here and talk about a feel-good story, a good news story on this particular beat. But 2 weeks ago, really at precisely this hour, I was on my way to Superior Court in downtown Tucson to see a judge officially sign off on a plea deal that would finally allow a man named Barry Jones to go home after almost 30 years of wrongful incarceration, of being on death row for a crime he always swore he didn't commit. The evidence showed he didn't commit, and that never should have led to a conviction in the first place. I won't go into all of the details or twists and turns, but suffice to say that Barry Jones was accused of and sent to death row of just the most horrific crime you can be charged with, which was the sexual assault and murder of a 4-year-old girl. Due to a complete failure of investigation, both by law enforcement and by Barry Jones's own trial attorneys, he was sent to death row and denied relief repeatedly until he had a chance to prove that he'd received ineffective assistance of counsel. And in 2018, a federal judge overturned that conviction. Entered this particular Supreme Court, and it turns out that the state of Arizona was able to take advantage of the newly radicalized right-wing court to get them to send Barry Jones back to death row, to say, actually, that federal judge was wrong. It does not matter that the evidence shows he did not commit this crime. The sort of notorious line of this oral argument became, innocence is not enough to grant relief to Barry Jones. And so it was pretty astonishing to be covering this case. When I started covering it in 2017, I never imagined that it would reach the Supreme Court, but when it did, The Intercept was absolutely out front in being the only place that had covered this case for years, and it proved to be very, very important in telling the story, telling the human story that otherwise would have been absent from this fairly technical decision. And so I'm extremely proud of that, and I'm extremely grateful to The Intercept for allowing me to go to Tucson so many times over the years to cover the twists and turns in this case. And I will say, the day of Barry's release, you can read about it at The Intercept. I wrote about this chaotic day that was really in many ways emblematic of just how dehumanizing this whole process has been for Barry Jones. But it was also a very beautiful thing to experience. So I really am grateful to Roger and everyone who's sort of continued to support this work. It makes all the difference.
So the innocence is not enough argument has popped up a number of times. So I'd like to zero in on that. For those of you who might think that we're very scripted, that I wasn't. I'm improvising here. Jordan, can you talk a little bit about the innocence is not enough argument and where we've seen it before? You two have covered stories where that was a factor before.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to say thanks to everybody for being here, to Roger, Annie, and everyone. I think broadly speaking, the innocence is not enough is a problem, obviously, of the law. That you are, once you're convicted, it's sort of the idea that that's what the system is there to reinforce. And it really does not like to give any leeway for you to prove otherwise. Even, if you've had a terrible trial, but the courts decided you didn't, even if they're totally wrong, that's just enough. And so you could have all manner of evidence lurking out there that sort of demonstrates that you are wrongly convicted, but the way the law is structured, it's very, very hard to get back in. And the courts just generally don't like to do that, right? So that is sort of where people who are wrongfully convicted find themselves constantly. I mean, people get exonerated not because the system really works, although judges like to say, see, the system worked, we exonerated you. But it's really in spite of the system that these people are able to overcome and like fly through 9, hoops of fire to make these incredibly technical arguments that get them back into court in the first place. So I think it's often quite shocking for people to hear that, because it's sort of notions of fairness, the idea if you can prove you're innocent, that should be enough. But oftentimes,
you're not even supposed to have to prove you're innocent, right? You're innocent until proven guilty, unless you've been found guilty in a court of law, and then even if you prove your innocence, you're out of luck.
It's just often not enough to convince the courts to overcome very technical hurdles, which I will say, going back even further than Barry Jones, Liliana has written about sort of extensively at TI. Another thing that other people really wouldn't write about because it's so technical, but she found a way to make it lively, which is about the EDPA, which is the anti-terrorism and effective death penalty,
yeah,
right? Which is really what governs a lot of this stuff, and it's really, really draconian, and just gives only these tiny narrow slivers from which to creep through. But meanwhile, offers courts all along the way, including the Supreme Court, lots of cover to just tighten those slivers even further on highly sort of mundane grounds, like you were a day over your filing deadline, or really weird technical twists of how you read the law. But Liliana's done a good job also of making that very human over the years, for which we should all be quite thankful.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, there's so much to talk about here, so we have to really pick and choose, because the subject is vast. But talk to us a little bit about how y'all choose the case, like what you're looking for, and because when you dig in, you read everything, you master everything. You go out in the field, you interview all the I mean, it's a big commitment for you to jump into a case. So Jordan, you just went. Liliana, but
Sure.
feel free to supplement each other.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors. So, I would definitely say that one thing that that grabs our attention right away is, if somebody writes to us about a case and says, hey, there's this, bad case out of, pick a county, they're everywhere, right? One of the things that I find most attention grabbing is if somebody can describe some of the basic elements of the case and maybe provide part of the record that you might be able to read up front. And, over time, you get really accustomed to seeing the red flags pretty early on. Whether it's a police report or a trial transcript, that's always, or that's often a big part of it. I will say that with Barry Jones, I literally heard from a federal defender in Arizona who I had come to know a bit and trusted. And he said, hey, there's this upcoming evidentiary hearing in this case. And he overnighted me like 8 DVD. He gave me like almost the entire record. And that certainly moved Barry Jones's case to the top of my list, because the more I read, the more disturbed I was. And I think there's some version of that happens over and over again with both of us, and certainly the cases we tackle together, right, Jordan?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always am looking for, there are also other obvious considerations. One is if somebody's facing a looming execution, or they have some major development in their case that's like on the horizon, that sometimes will push things to the top because there's something, actionable happening in the near future. But otherwise, always want the police report. Always read that first, because, a wrongful conviction is not like one bad actor ever. It's never, ever, ever one. It's always a systems problem and just breakdowns along the way. But you can really see that things are going to go wrong right from the beginning of the police report, with really shoddy investigation, or like bad, early forensics reports where you're just like, oh no. So then try to build from there generally.
So you just mentioned forensics reports. You both have written a lot about forensics and about the pseudoscience, junk science that has gone into a lot of the really their conventions and myths about criminal investigation. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that play? Some of the you talked about the red flags. Let's talk about bite marks, or flame analysis, or some of the and there's some very comical examples of this. I mean, it's very serious business, but when you talk about it, it's almost like a clown show.
Yeah, I think largely part of the problem, like forensics, in the last 25, 30 years has really become more sort of in the public imagination through obviously things like CSI, but also like the long running reality show Forensic Files. And they present them as if this was all like there's a science underneath this, right? It's forensic science. And so you kind of take for granted that these kind of have some underpinning to them, but largely are developed instead by police agencies in the service of law enforcement. And so, they are often taken as if they are real. And I guess I would use that in air quotes, like as if they have this underpinning and sort of this rigorous history to show that they work. Unfortunately, most do not. And I think what we've tried to do is sort of show that over and over again. And it gets, it can get quite controversial when you start to kind of go after the underpinnings of things like fingerprints. The fingerprint community gets a little bit wound up about it. But, I think they also realize that they need more help. But you look at bite marks. I mean, it's very much something that sort of caught on in the 50s. There was like a Texas case that involved a piece of cheese. That's basically the first sort of modern bite mark case. And, it just kind of goes off from there. With some very, I think, well-meaning dentists who kind of believed that they could tell if somebody had bitten a crime victim, very much convinced themselves up that, build up an industry in a way that they would certify each other and all manner of thing. And then once it gets allowed into court, that's where the real trouble begins, because once it has been accepted into evidence and a conviction is built around it or even features it, then the courts are very inclined to allow that in other cases and other jurisdictions. And that's the way that for junk science kind of snowballs into where we are now. It becomes incredibly hard to then extract it. Though I will say that bite marks are, hopefully quite dead right now. I think there's been so much, attention to them, and the scientific community has really has said we should not throw any more money at this. We should not be using this in court. It needs to go away. But, it's really hard to unring that bell, right? And so that's kind of what we find ourselves doing a lot. I think it's an area, I don't think that people realize how sort of prevalent forensics are generally in the criminal justice system, and people have not focused on it a lot over the years. And I think some reporters also fall into the myth that this stuff is reliable without really understanding its sort of origin story and the lack of scientific underpinning. And I think one thing I will say it's great about TI is it really has supported this and understood that forensic evidence and junk science needs to be weeded out of the criminal justice system, and that focusing on it makes a difference because it shows its head in so many cases in so many different sort of ways. Right, Liliana?
Yeah, I would just quickly add, a lot of the work we do ends up being showing how even in those fields of forensics that have been thoroughly discredited, even when we know that the evidence at the heart of a given case is junk, there are so many people still languishing in prison, serving sentences based on that very science. Again, with the bite mark, we recently, we attended the parole hearing for a man in Alabama who's been in prison for 30 years, for killing his wife based on a single bite mark. And so they're really tragic cases. And so, yeah, we're lucky to be able to spend so much time on these kinds of stories.
And so some of this kind of evidence was at the heart of the Claude Garrett case, wasn't it? And that is a particularly poignant case. So maybe you could say a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about some sort of. Well, go ahead and say something about that, please.
Sure. No, just to be brief about it, Claude Garrett, it was actually my first big investigation for the Intercept. In February of 2015, he was accused of setting a fire, of purposefully killing his girlfriend in a fire in Nashville, Tennessee, not far from where I live. And for, again, one of those cases where I wrote a big piece, then sort of followed it for years. It's a case that's especially close to my heart because in that case, I can absolutely point to, my reporting actually did make a large difference, along with the work of many other people in eventually, Claude Garrett went up for parole. He was denied, but my article about that denial caught the attention of the local DA here in Nashville, and he started looking into it. And within a couple of years, the conviction review unit was looking at it, and Claude Garrett walked out of prison last year in May of 2022, which was, one of the most sort of memorable, certainly the most memorable, meaningful professional experience I've ever had. Sadly, the coda to that event was that Claude Garrett only survived in the outside world for less than 6 months. He died very suddenly last fall. So I wrote about that. But yeah, it's another one of those cases. It was entirely based on discredited arson science. And we don't even know how many cases there are out there like that.
So let's talk about why we keep. So it's not just the bad science. It's not just the bad policing. We also have this this political context that and that refuses to support the work of journalists who uncover these cases and there's this exploitation of victims' families. It's a very systematic problem. are there some observations that you, or conclusions you can draw about why these patterns show up again and again? I guess that's the question. I mean, and maybe if that's too hard or too vague or abstract, what I find so compelling about these cases and about your reporting is that they illuminate everything around them. They illuminate the very sort of small cases too, because these things happen again and again and again to people every day.
Yeah.
Is that too broad? Jordan, you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, the system is theoretically set up, to provide protection and justice, but it doesn't. It just doesn't. It's filled with people. That's part of the problem, right? And subjective views and biases, and they get baked in and sort of follow through, and it sucks up everything in its wake. It just does, and there's not just, in every story, I think, there's not just one victim, right? There's not just the person whose death is being sought, some answer for. It's their family and the families around them and the defendants and their families. It's sort of a sprawling, Liliana, help me out, save me.
Everything
Where am I going?
Everything you're saying is true. And I guess, when, we were discussing this a little bit before about the sort of scope and scale of this, like, how do you quantify it? And the truth is, if you were to look at a map of this country and blindly pick one location, you will find these stories. I mean, it is a systemic problem. These cases aren't aberrations. They are, a product of how we have constructed and amended this legal system. And that's just, that's a really daunting truth to sort of confront, but I think it's critically important, because I agree with Jordan. I mean, this system really, at its core, I've come to believe is fundamentally set up for punishment, and who those punishments serve, tends to be pretty opaque. Death penalty cases are not, executions are not serving victims most of the time. This idea of closure is bankrupt through and through. So I guess, there's a lot that sort of plays into these cases. But I guess the other thing I would add is, there's a ton of bad incentives. The system is just chock full of bad incentives that allow, for example, in death penalty cases, the reason the death penalty is on the decline in part comes down to the fact that fewer and fewer jurisdictions are seeking death sentences. But in those places that do, it often comes down to one prosecutor or one office that has has political ambitions, that is using this as a political weapon. You see that is one of the reasons the system survives. And so you really can't separate the politics, the incentives, elected judges, all of that plays into this mess that we try to untangle sort of one story at a time.
Yeah.
We have an attendee question, and this is something that we think about a lot, and we've talked about a lot, which is the question is, how do you balance emotional investment in the injustices you see? And a corollary to that is how it's not just about balance, it's about how do you protect yourself from what you are constantly looking at every day in your reporting.
I mean, I think the honest answer is that I don't know. I don't know that I'm all that good at it. You try to, it's a lot, right? And I don't know that there's a really good answer for that, because I don't know that there's a perfect solution. But one thing that I will say is that I feel very fortunate that I have Liliana as a colleague, and that we get not only to collaborate, which really kind of helps when you're sort of processing those things, become sounding boards for each other to kind of work through stuff, but also because we've both been doing this long enough that, it's not even that we have to be working on the same piece together. We kind of get where we're coming from. And so that's been really, and to kind of work in an environment where we've been allowed to do that is really actually helps quite a bit, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe that goes to answer part of it, Liliana.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. I don't know that I could do this work day in and day out with having sort of Jordan's, like when we did the podcast, you're dealing with so much trauma and so much ugliness and so much violence. And yet, especially during our reporting trips, having each other to sort of process this in real time, but also decompress. I mean, you find yourself, everyone develops a sort of gallows humor doing this work. Everybody, we are not unique in that sense. And so that does a lot. I mean, otherwise, I guess in our individual lives, we have pets, we have our partners, we do what we can to get some exercise, you do all the things that you can do. But I also find that, writing the thing, experiencing this thing, trying, and that there's a lot actually that I find valuable in just sort of writing it as an outlet. That was certainly true when I was covering the federal executions during the Trump administration. That was a pretty challenging time. I think in retrospect, I realized how challenging it was. But what kept me going, I think, aside from a sense of urgency, was that I was writing articles constantly. I had somewhere to put it. And I think that's critically important in helping me sort of metabolize this dark material.
Yeah. And I think having the impact that you two have must be incredibly rewarding. I mean, I know it is for me to see Barry Jones walk free.
Absolutely. And the feedback we've gotten,
the payoff there is so human and infinite. Really, you just can't you can't use that up, really. So let's talk a little bit in vague terms, because that's the way we have to do it, about what you're working on now. And that I mean, that has a lot to do with the perverse incentives.
Yeah. What can we say? We have a big project. Jordan, you start us off.
Oh God, why? Okay. We have a big project that involves that is really a story about rather breathtaking prosecutorial misconduct across a particular prosecutor's rather lengthy career, and the sort of implications of that, told largely through one case where we've been able to see how this misconduct sort of worked. Does that make sense? Where you can see how a prosecutor has basically betrayed both legal and ethical obligations in really sort of breathtaking ways. Sort of it's exposed through one case, but in so doing sort of implicates others. It's kind of actually hard to know where it ends, where this all kind of ends. But that's sort of a broad stroke, I guess. But we could talk a little bit about one of the elements that
let's do that.
Yeah, one of the sort of main elements in this one particular case is the use of jailhouse informants, which are a particularly problematic sort of evidence for a variety of reasons. Liliana, would you like to pick up there?
Well, again, talk about bad incentives. I mean, these are deals that are cut with people who are often incarcerated, facing some serious time, who cut a deal with the state to sort of say, can you testify to X, Y, or Z? And you're gonna, to put it in the most basic sort of dumbed down terms, obviously, that problem, again, infects the system as a whole. Jordan has done some incredible reporting going back years now out of LA, to sort of uncovering this incredible network, and just, I don't even know what you would call it, like how to quantify it, but the way in which it worked in one jurisdiction. And again, you can duplicate this, sometimes it pops up in cases and it's not even the primary element, but it's yet another red flag, another rotten piece of the puzzle. And so, this particular case reveals the use of informants, a sort of pattern of that kind of evidence. We're still sort of trying to sort out what you can say about how much this particular prosecutor knew about the false information that was being presented versus, whether this was a big conspiracy. But we all know that this happens in courtrooms across the country, and it's a huge issue. So we hope to sort of make that partly the heart of this very large, sprawling story.
We have another question, which really is a perfect corollary to that, because the question is, how long on average do you follow a case to get this story? How many cases do you follow that do not end up being a story for the Intercept? So it's probably impossible to quantify or put an average on that. But the story that we were just talking about, for example, I know you've been working on this for a long time.
Yeah, I mean this particular story came to me actually amid the pandemic. And I think that's partially why it was not, like, could not act as quickly, but it also was so quickly realized, oh my God, there's a lot here. Like, this is a giant sweater to unravel. So yeah, we've been like looking at it on and off, but more seriously, obviously this year. But sometimes, a lot of times, gosh, I mean, there's a guy in Texas on death row named Rodney Reed. I've literally been writing about his story since 2001. So what's that? I'll be entering my 22nd year of covering that case. So it obviously depends. That case I wish would resolve in the way that it should, but it doesn't look like it's going to anytime soon. So have another.
One of the first pieces of yours that I edited. I think the first piece that I edited was the Glossop story in 2015, and we're still covering that.
Right, exactly. I mean, they just take so long, and sometimes you just feel like nothing is happening. And then suddenly, some things, it's always happening behind the scenes. So it takes a lot of diligence to follow them. But as to the other point, which I think is how many that you follow that maybe don't end up for stories, is that the other part of that question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Golly. I mean, I think we're always tracking so many things at once, I feel like, and just sort of trying to figure out, right, Liliana? I mean, I feel like there's way more cases than we could possibly ever write about, and they're constantly, but we're still watching them all the time and trying to figure out when and if we can jump in, right?
It's true. And yeah, I think one of the really lovely things about doing this work for long enough is and establishing yourself as a reporter who covers this stuff is that you get more tips all the time, from some really good sources. The flip side of that is that you can't take them all, you can't write about all of them, and that sometimes haunts me, but there are certainly, cases, trials, any number of, kind of ongoing message. The thing is, these things, they don't just go away. The story, it will be there for when you do have time for it, for better or worse.
Yeah.
So I guess one of the things that I always come back to is how this work can have these dramatic results where we actually succeed in having someone be exonerated, and sometimes it results in a lot of exonerations, which is kind of my ambition for the story you're working on now, to see a cascading effect. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, but these things do also illuminate the larger context of the criminal justice system, and we've touched on this in different ways. Liliana, you've written about the roots of the death penalty, and I think of this a lot of ways. Our whole mass incarceration system, and the death penalty in particular, is a continuation of slavery by other means. And you've uncovered some really powerful material about that. I wonder if you have some thoughts about that, and then furthermore, and to kind of sort of bring us to a close, if you have any thoughts about how people can support the work that you do, in terms of encouragement, or I'll just leave it there. What is it that people can do in their lives that supports the larger project that we're involved in, which is fighting this kind of injustice? Yeah,
well, the first part, obviously, thank you for asking that, because it's always front of mind when the Rodney Reed case comes up. And Jordan and I were just talking, Rodney Reed was just denied yet again relief. We see the same thing over and over again. And this is a case of a Black man who was accused of killing a white woman. I won't go into the details, but it is absolutely emblematic of everything that we know to be true about the death penalty in this country, which is, especially in the southern states, it is a direct outgrowth of lynching, of lynch law, and of white supremacy. And, you know, I've lived in the South for a little while now, and some years ago I decided I wanted to spend a bit of time in Alabama, around the time that the Equal Justice Initiative unveiled its museum, its lynching memorial, which, if you haven't seen it, it's worth visiting. But it's really through sort of visiting these places and understanding the sort of narratives of white supremacy and racial violence, and the justifications that were given at the time for lynching and for lynch law, that it was something that we needed in order to protect and prevent violence against white women, explicitly by Black men. I mean, those connections are so clear when you trace them to a case like the Rodney Reed case. And so, you know, through archival research, through just being on the ground, through talking to historians, I mean, that it's a lesson I sort of learn again and again in this work. And I think it really can't be forgotten, especially as we see a ruling like yesterday's in the Rodney Reed case. I mean, it's so important to know that history and remind people of that history in this work. And then, I don't know, as far as how to support us, I mean, reading and sharing our work is obviously a really important step. What do you say, Jordan?
Absolutely. Read, share, and then, of course, you know, when and if possible, donate to support it, because it's time consuming and it's expensive to get it right. And, you know, and to get really drilled down in there. I think those are the things that we would like to do and try to do to illuminate these connections and these problems, and to try to help people get out of prison that don't belong there. So yeah, that's what I would say.
So I think that takes us right down to the end. I just want to thank you both for the work you do. It's I know that you're driven to do this work, but I also think that it's on some level almost a sacrificial project. That, you know, what you have to deal with in your work is it's a heavy load. So thank you, and thank you for joining us, and thank you all on the call for coming and listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today. Roger, Jordan, Liliana, so appreciative of your time and digging into these stories with our supporters and board members. You know, this work was really one of the reasons I wanted to join the Intercept, because it's so important and it has such impact, and it's so hard to do it. And I feel so lucky to work with all of you in a place where we can dedicate the time and resources to do this really kind of meaningful, impactful journalism. So everyone who joined us today, thank you so much. We'll wrap up now, and really appreciate your spending time with us, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.